Question 82 of the Summa Theologia is about the human will. And as you can see, as we are now in the 8th question on the treatise on man, the treatise on human nature, St. Thomas Aquinas is covering all the different aspects, all the faculties of the human person, because, as I had mentioned before, we are rather complicated creatures. We have pretty much everything, the passions and the appetites and the intellect and the will and the desires and the body and the soul and spirit, and there's a whole lot going on inside the human person. That's why we are really the most fascinating creature around. Angels are pretty fascinating, but they don't have as much going on as we do. This particular question has 5 articles, and the way that St. Thomas Aquinas describes a will is an intellectual appetite. We have a sensitive appetite, which has to do with our senses, our passions, and then we also have an intellectual appetite, which is closely connected to the intellect and the will, and there's going to be questions within these articles comparing the intellect and the will and how they kind of relate to each other, so it is quite interesting as well. Article 1 says, whether the will desires something of necessity. That means, does the will have to desire anything in particular? Now, your first thought might be, well, no, because if that was the case, we wouldn't have free will, and that's a very legitimate response. But Thomas is going to say there is one thing that every will desires, and in that regard, it doesn't really have a choice. And he starts off in this first paragraph talking about necessity, different examples of necessity and what he means by that. He said the word necessity is employed in many ways. We say that everything composed of contraries is of necessity corruptible. When we say that it is necessary for 3 angles of a triangle to be equal to 2 right angles, now that's necessary, and this is natural and absolute necessity. That means it has to happen. On the other part of the end, as when without, on the other part of the end, as when without it, the end is not to be attained or so well attained. For instance, food is necessary for life. You have to have food, right, to live. On the part of the agent, a thing is to be when someone is forced by some agent so that he is not able to do the contrary, therefore it's necessary. This is called necessary of coercion. Now, this is what St. Thomas Aquinas wants to get away from, is that we are coerced to desire something intellectually. He said this necessary of coercion is altogether repugnant to the will. For we call that violent, which is against the inclination of a thing, but the very movement of the will is an inclination to something. So it would be repugnant if we were inclined to something that we didn't want. If we were inclined, we had to do something, or is necessary that we will something that we don't otherwise want. But that's not the case. Therefore, as a thing is called natural because it is according to the inclination of nature, so a thing is called voluntary because it is according to the inclination of the will. So it's something natural and also necessary. That's what he's getting at. Or is that a contradiction in terms? Therefore, just as it is impossible for a thing to be at the same time violent and natural, so it is impossible for a thing to be absolutely coerced or violent and voluntary. So again, we wouldn't be coerced into something that we naturally desire, because that would not be coercion, because we want it. But necessity of end is not repugnant to the will when the end cannot be attained except in one way. Thus, from the will to cross the sea arises the will of necessity to wish for a ship. So he's saying, okay, we want to cross the sea. We desire, we need to have a ship. Of course, they didn't have planes back then. And so it's conducive to the trip that we're going to take. And so it's necessary, but it's okay. We want it. In like manner, neither is natural necessity repugnant to the will. Indeed, more than this, for the intellect of necessity adheres to first principles. The will must of necessity adhere to the last end, which is happiness. That's why I put the smiley face there, in case you were wondering. Everybody desires happiness, and we cannot not want happiness. Sorry for the double negative. Since the end is in practical matters, what the principle in speculative, this principle is in speculative matters. For what befits a thing naturally and immovably must be the root and principle of all else appertaining thereto, since the nature of a thing is the first in everything, and every movement arises from something immovable. So do you see what he's saying here? Yes, it's necessary, but it's also not repugnant to nature. It's not repugnant to the will because we're naturally desiring happiness and we all want to be happy, right? So it's not anything that is negative. Article 2, whether the will desires of necessity whatever it desires. I put this ice cream here because we all pretty much desire ice cream, but not everybody. But is everything desired of necessity? Well, I think if that was the case, we wouldn't have free will, because every single decision on our way to happiness would be predetermined, and therefore it's all necessary. He says the will does not desire of necessity whatsoever it desires. In order to make this evident, we must observe that as the intellect naturally and of necessity adheres to the first principles, so the will adheres to the last end, as we have already said in the last article. Now, there are some things intelligible which have not a necessary connection with first principles, such as contingent propositions, the denial of which does not involve a denial of the first principle. So he's saying even though our intellect naturally is associated with first principles, it doesn't mean that everything that our intellect comes to know or is associated with is necessarily related to those first principles directly. There are some contingencies and some things that may or may not be associated with that directly. And so such the intellect does not assent of necessity. But there are some propositions which have a necessary connection with the first principles, such as demonstrable conclusions, a denial of which involves a denial of the first principles. So there are some things that we have to connect intellectually with our intellectual and or first principles, which are the first principles that we come to know naturally and without any kind of deliberation. And to these the intellect assents of necessity, when once it is aware of the necessary connection of these conclusions with the principles. But it does not assent of necessity until through the demonstrable it recognizes the necessity of such a connection. Okay, that's a little bit tricky there, but he says it's the same way with the will. In the same way with the will, there are certain individual goods which have not a necessary connection with happiness. All right, so I use this. This is more of a sensitive appetite than an intellectual appetite, but we don't have to have ice cream to be happy. We desire it. We don't have to have a master's degree, which we may desire. We don't have to be married to be happy. We don't have, so there's a lot of things that are contingent but not absolutely necessary, right? Because without them, a man can be happy, and to such the will does not adhere of necessity, but there are some things which have a necessary connection with happiness, by means of which man adheres to God, in whom alone true happiness consists. So there are some things, especially related to God, that if a man does not adhere to, he's not going to be happy. Nevertheless, until through the certitude of the divine vision, the necessity of such connection be shown, the will does not adhere to God of necessity, nor to those things which are of God. In heaven, we adhere to God of necessity because we have the beatific vision. We're united to God. We can't go away from him. We can't not love him or desire him or know him. But the will of the man who sees God in his essence of necessity adheres to God, just as now we desire of necessity to be happy. It is therefore clear that the will does not desire of necessity whatever it desires. Isn't that an interesting comparison? We naturally desire to be happy. We don't have any choice of that. When we get to heaven, when we're united to beatitude, when we're united to God, we can't not desire him. It's set, okay? And you can't go away from something which is perfect happiness. Why would you? Whether the will is a higher power than the intellect, all right? I have these two warriors battling there. Which one is higher, the intellect or the will? He says, if therefore the intellect and the will be considered with regard to themselves, then the intellect is a higher power. And this is clear if we compare their respective objects to one another. For the object of the intellect is more simple and more absolute than the object of the will, since the object of the intellect is the very idea of appetible good. So, using that example, if you desire intellectually to be married, well, that's a will. The desire is the will, but you have to first know what marriage is, and that's in the intellect. So it's more simple, right? The idea of which is in the intellect, is the object of the will. Now, the more simple and the more abstract a thing, the nobler and higher it is in itself, and therefore the object of the intellect is higher than the object of the will. But relatively and by comparison with something else, we find that the will is sometimes higher than the intellect from the fact that the object of the will occurs in something higher than that in which occurs the object of the intellect. All right, so what he's going to say here is that when the object of the will, or something that is desired because it's good, is higher than the person that is desiring it or knowing it, well, then the will is more important, right? He's going to give an example here, and okay, he says, wherefore the love of God is the love of God is better than the knowledge of God, but on the contrary, the knowledge of corporeal things is better than the love of them. Absolutely, however, the intellect is nobler than the will. Okay, so it's better to know pizza than to love pizza. It's better to know your dog than to love your dog, because they're lower than you. But it's better to love God than to know God. Okay, and I think you could also say it's better to love an angel than to know an angel. Whether the will moves the intellect. A thing is said to be moved in two ways. First, as an end, for instance, when we say that the end moves the agent. In this way, the intellect moves the will because the good understood is the object of the will. Again, you can't desire something until you know it, right? And moves as an end. Second, a thing is said to move as an agent, as what alters moves what is altered, and what impels moves what is impelled. In this way, the will moves the intellect and all the powers of the soul, as Anselm says. Now, this is really interesting. Let me see. Because the intellect and the will work so closely together that it's hard to say one is greater than the other or one moves the other, because they're just working in concert with each other. The reason is because wherever we have order among a number of active powers, that power which regards the universal end moves the powers which regard particular ends. Okay, this is so important. The universal versus the particular. We talked about the problem of universals, nominalism, realism. It's all about universals. Now, the object of the will is good and the end in general, and each power is directed to some suitable good proper to it, as sight is directed to the perception of color, and the intellect to the knowledge of truth. Therefore, the will as agent moves all the powers of the soul to the respective ends, except the natural powers of the vegetative part, which are not subject to our will. So that's like the circulation of blood and the excretory system and the respiratory system. They're not waiting for the command of the will because they just happen automatically. Number 5, Article 5, whether we should distinguish irascible and concupiscible parts in the superior appetite. Superior appetite is the will. Remember, concupiscible and irascible are passions. They're powers of the soul. They're things we desire, things we're repelled by, things like hope and fear and despair and love and hate, and these kind of things. Thomas says the irascible and concupiscible are not parts of the intellectual appetite, which is called the will. Now, the explanation is rather interesting. He says, now the sensitive appetite does not consider the common notion of good, because neither do the senses apprehend the universal. Remember, the senses apprehend particulars, and therefore the parts of the sensitive appetite are differentiated by the different notions of particular good. For the concupiscible regards as proper to the notion of good, as something pleasant to the senses and suitable to nature, whereas the irascible regards the notion of good as something that wards off and repels what is hurtful. But the will regards good according to the common notion of good, and therefore, in the will, which is the intellectual appetite, there is no differentiation of appetitive powers, so that there be in the intellectual appetite an irascible power distinct from a concupiscible power. So the will is associated with the universal. The intellect abstracts universals out of material things. The senses are associated with particular things. Our eyes see a particular frog, a particular rock, a particular butterfly. Our eyes don't see universal forms. That's the intellect, okay? And the will is associated with them as well. But since the concupiscible and the irascible are passions having to do with our senses, they are associated with individuals and not with universals. All right, I hope this made sense. I hope you enjoyed this. Tomorrow we'll get into free will, which is another interesting topic in the Summa. And that's going to do it for question number 82. Thanks for joining me in this journey through the Summa, one question at a time. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. God bless you.